our absolute pleasure, everybody, to welcome you to the second seminar of the International Corporate Governance Society 2023, our March seminar here. And it's our absolute pleasure to welcome Bill McNabb, the third, who is with us here today. So Bill doesn't actually need an introduction, but I'm still going to give him one, okay? So Bill has been the CEO of Vanguard Group from 2008 until 2017. He has also been the chairman of Vanguard Group from 2010 and 2018. He's still super active when it comes to corporate governance, and that's also the reason why he's here today, of course. He is currently a member of the board of directors at UnitedHealth Group, at IBM, Axiom, Vanilla, and at Altruist. And he's also the vice chair of the board of directors at Nexi. He's also engaged with different non-profit organizations. So, for example, very prominently, he was the CEO of Force for Good, where he's the co-chair of the Strategic Investor Initiatives. As the National Association of Corporate Directors, which represents more than 23,000 board members, he co-chairs the Future of the American Boardroom Commission. So he's sharing some of the insight of that work with us here today. Bill is also affiliated with several very prestigious academic institutions. And as an academic, that is, of course, what we love to see, that those prominent directors and CEOs still stay connected to academia here and exchange knowledge. So you're affiliated with the LeBeau College of Business, the Ira Milstein Center for Global Markets and Corporate Ownership at Columbia University, and you're also a fellow at the Wharton Center for Leadership and Change Management, and Wharton is also where you received your MBA. So the talk today has the topic of corporate governance matters, lessons learned as a chairman of an asset management firm and as a director of public companies. And when we talked before, you indicated that you have what you call a deep appreciation for what you call strong corporate governance. And of course, it would be fantastic if you could tell us a little bit what you understand under corporate governance. If you could share a little bit with us your experience about corporate governance as a chairman and as a current board member, and maybe give us some outlook about where is corporate governance heading in the years to come. So Bill, I'm going to be quiet now. I'm going to give the floor to you. And we have lots of time for Q&A. So please, everybody, feel free to post your questions either in the Q&A or in the chat here. I will monitor the chat and then post the questions to Bill once he's done. Without further ado, Bill, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, George. And it's a pleasure to be here and speaking to all of you. A little daunting, given the breadth of countries and experiences represented in the audience. So what I'm gonna try to do in the next few minutes is, set a little bit of context. And then, as George said, I really do want to take as many questions as possible. I will confess that this will be a little more US-centric than perhaps is fitting for such a global audience. But at Vanguard, when I joined Vanguard, we were a little tiny firm, little US mutual fund firm. And when I retired as chairman and CEO, we had $5 trillion under management, all in, 95% in US mutual funds. Our global businesses are really concentrated in the UK and Australia, and pretty focused. So we're still pretty focused on the US, which is, again, where a lot of my experience is. I thought the way to frame some of this might be to give you a little bit of an annotated history from my perspective of how governance has changed in the certainly the course of my career, and what I witnessed at Vanguard. And I would say a couple of things to sort of begin that discussion. One, I think as investors in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, the term governance was barely used inside the halls of Vanguard or any other firm for that matter. What you really you thought about it as much more an administrative function where you were, voting proxies to approve accounting firms and, elect the directors and so forth. But the thing that and one of the comments I remember distinctly was asking one of our active managers, how much of a role did governance play in their investment decisions, and the answer was less than zero. So it was the term just didn't get a lot of use, and the function wasn't talked about. There were some early pioneers, Ira Milstein, who's now associated with Columbia, with whom I get a chance to work. Marty Lipton, obviously some of his early writings, the Weinberg Center at the University of Delaware, LeBeau College, Drexel Universities, and Drexel's Center for Corporate Governance. There began to be a lot of work done there in the U.S. and several other places as well. But for the most part, this was really much more an academic topic than a practical topic. For us at Vanguard, this began to change in the early 2000s. We had experienced sort of the greenmail phenomenon of the late 90s in particular, where corporate raiders would come into companies, take a relatively small stake, 1 or 2% shareholdings, and then propose massive changes to the company, where it might be an M&A transaction that the company hadn't contemplated, or it might be spinning off a division, or it might be levering the balance sheet aggressively to increase return on equity and so forth. And these greenmailers were particularly aggressive in going after individual board members who they wanted to replace and so forth. And my predecessor at Vanguard, Jack Brennan, really recognized this phenomenon probably before any of the other, broad-based investors in the U.S. markets. And as you may know about Vanguard, a lot of what we do, we run active equity, we run active fixed income, but we're most well known for our index equity products. And as indexers, you're essentially a permanent shareholder in all the companies within an index. So you don't get to sell a stock when you don't like it. If it's in the benchmark, you hold it. And we began to question among ourselves that were some of these greenmail actions actually benefiting our companies in the long run. And I'm going to stress long run here because one of the things about the Vanguard client base, we're a retail mutual fund company, but our average investor was with us for more than 12 years. And so in a sense, pretty long-term, vis-a-vis other types of investors in the marketplace. And so we sat around conference rooms and strategy sessions, really talking through some of the activities that were taking place in the market. While they might boost short-term returns of particular holdings, were they actually harming the long-term sustainable value creation capacity of some of our holdings? And so Jack, as a result of this, issued really the first of the big investor letters to portfolio companies. After Jack did it, and then I followed him shortly as CEO and with my own version. And then we saw many other, many other of our peer companies follow suit. BlackRock's became, one of the most watched things, and as several other organizations as well. But in our first letter came out in 2004, and it basically had 4 critical points. One was we're very long term in our orientation. We only are worried about long term. Second, and related to that, we're always going to vote with what best serves the long-term interests of our investors. Because again, this was not our money. Time Jack wrote this, we probably were managing $800 billion, and it's $800 billion of other people's money, in particular, lots of little investors, lots of families relying on us. We never wanted to forget that. The third point he laid out in the letter was we believed very strongly in the strength and independence of boards. And, as a permanent shareholder, that was going to be one of our initial focuses, was how independent and how strong is the board. And then related to that, the last point was we were going to encourage boards, not just the management of the company, to actually engage with large investors to hear what was on the large investors' minds, in particular around governance. So, again, in my humble opinion, this is the beginning of what I will call the modern era of governance. As I said, some of the early pioneers, you look at what Ira Milstein had written and what Marty Lipton had written and, what the folks at the Weinberg Center had been publishing, it was sort of encouraging some of the same kind of activity, but it really was much more from a theoretical and academic perspective as opposed to practitioners actually taking the flag and saying, okay, we're going to run with this. And I think there were multiple other factors that contributed, if you will, to the momentum that this letter created. So it wasn't certainly just our letter out there by itself, but it got a lot of people's attention. I think in the first year, we did several hundred engagements with boards for the first time where they wanted to know, so how are you going to vote on this? Or how are you thinking about this issue and so forth? But I think what went along with this was the rise of activists, so the new era, so the green mailers had evolved. And, you saw, in particular in the hedge fund industry, some very prominent investors become much more vocal in terms of what they were trying to do to shake up boardrooms. You also saw the beginning of what I would call social activists, people who had particular, whether it was climate, whether it was equity, whether it was some more narrow slice of governance, but they were really passionate about that, those topics. Secondly, there's just much more greater scrutiny by the outside world on what was going on in boardrooms. This was probably best exemplified by the say on pay vote. And as you know, say on pay was not binding, but the whole idea that you had to do it was a huge shock to corporate America. And actually, I actually think it was a good thing. We could debate, how effective it's been. I think there are data. I'd be interested in whether any of you have actually studied this in it deeply, but some of the data I've seen would suggest that say on pay actually has moved the dial toward better accountability around compensation, has not addressed the big elephant in the room, which is how much is too much, which is, again, a whole different set of questions, but very important. But anyway, this greater scrutiny, and again, I say exemplified by say on pay, we went through a major financial crisis, which of course always tends to, in the GFC, which always tends to accelerate underlying trends. The public versus private company debate became much more in the forefront. As if you go back to 1999, in the US, there were just under 10,000 public companies. That number is under 4,500 today. Some of that was natural. There were some companies that never should have gone public in the tech go-go days of 1999, early 2000. But I think that actually the more telling statistic, and I may not get this exactly right, but I think the last data I looked at, somewhere around 2013, 2014, there were 17 so-called unicorns globally, private companies worth $1 billion. Today, that number is about 2,000. Maybe shrinking a little bit with what's going on in the markets right now, but it's of that order of magnitude. And so all of a sudden, you began to see this other way of thinking about governance as well as managing and running a business become much more preeminent in the marketplace. I actually think it's made the whole public company governance even more complicated. There's some pluses to it and there are some minuses to it. And again, we can get into that in some of the questions. Three other factors just to mention that I think along with, Jack Brennan's early letter really have helped accelerate this focus on governance. One's the rise of ISS and Glass Lewis. Again, I have strong opinions on that, which we can get into in the Q&A. But I think a lot of small investors in particular just didn't want to deal with these complexities, these new challenging issues that governance was raising. And they, in a sense, just said, we're just going to do whatever ISS and Glass Lewis say. And, that's going to be our decision. Probably the most important change, though, in this period is actually the complete change in the way money is actually managed on behalf of, in particular, individuals, but also at an institutional level to a degree, and that's the rise of indexing. So today, if you look at the ownership of any American, public company, 20 to 25% of that ownership is represented by the big index firms: Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, through their index capability, and you can add in a Northern Trust and Schwab and a couple of others to round that out. But you will get anywhere from 25 to 30% of any ownership. And there are pluses and minuses to that, and again, we can get into some of this in the Q&A. One of the pluses from my perspective is, and I think as a sitting board member, is it's permanent capital. Like, these firms are going to be with you through thick and thin. The flip side is they therefore want more of a say in terms of how you're governed. And, again, BlackRock in particular, Vanguard, State Street have been pretty vocal about views on this. And by the way, the views aren't always in sync with each other. In fact, quite often they're different. And then the last trend, which again to this audience will not be news, is in a lot of ways the whole ESG movement is I think a reflection of some of this activity, but also a broader question around the role of other stakeholders and their involvement in in governance, capital markets, et cetera. So when you look at that, it's a lot of change, probably as profound a set of changes as we've seen in the capital markets and in corporate world anytime, certainly in my lifetime. But you really, if you look back over the last 100 years, there are only a couple of other events, or pivots, if you will, that have been as dramatic as this one. And I don't think we're done. I think there's still a lot more work to be that's going to proceed, but it's really a big difference. And it's interesting. Probably the biggest the biggest blinding flash of the obvious I had as I retired and moved into the boardroom as an active board member was, it's really hard. It's much harder than I think I thought it was, and much harder, I think, than it was 20 years ago. I talked to one of my long-term board member, who's a colleague of mine in one of the boards I'm on, and I said, he goes, this used to be actually a pretty simple thing. Like, our main job was get the right CEO and, in a sense, get out of his or her way and let them run the company, and just try to hold them accountable to long-term results. But in the end, it was really, we picked the right leader, and boy, that there is so much more that goes on now in the best run boardrooms, and so in no particular order, I thought what I might do to just sort of again tee up our question and answer period is just give you a sense of how boards are responding to this changing environment. And the first point would be boards in the best run boardrooms anyway, certainly in the public, and I would say in the private markets as well. They totally get that it's not just about selecting the right CEO. It doesn't mean that selection of the CEO is unimportant. It's incredibly important. The leader sets the tone. But we, if you look at how time is spent in most major boardrooms, it is much more than just picking the right chief executive officer. And I'll come back to that in a second. Second, the second big change, and I think the way a lot of boards are responding to this new world, this new environment, is a lot of self-examination in terms of who's on the board. And we've had skill matrices for a number of years, but I can tell you in every boardroom I'm in, there is a constant re-examination of those matrices, and are they really right? You can create these beautiful boxes and little check marks and so forth, but do they really capture what you're trying to build in terms of a team with complementary skill sets? Third point, I think for a lot of boards, and this is particularly true for me at least, is the convergence of thinking between private boards and public boards. And what I mean by that is, in a private company, the one thing that you're really struck by on day one is the investor is in the room, not just, it's not an investor relations issue. The investor is actually in the room. If you're a private equity sponsored company or a venture capital backed company, that's literally true. Your board will be composed of usually several investors. Interesting, that mindset is making its way into a lot of public company boardrooms. And it's no longer just an IR function or something that management talks about, but the board is constantly asking themselves, what would a major investor think about this discussion? And what would be their reaction? I have to, and again, this will sound, like I'm patting myself on the back, and I'm not. I think it's one of the reasons why I've had, a number of companies reach out to me about being on their boards, is they actually want that investor perspective formally in the boardroom. And it's interesting how often those questions end up coming up. Fourth and very much related is in every boardroom, a lot of discussion about how do we actually engage with investors. And my two big public boards just finished their outreach to 20 large investors. We've got proxy season coming up. There are a couple of shareholder proposals on each of the proxies, and lead directors as well as CEOs or chairs going out together to talk to big investors about how are you thinking about this? What should we be thinking about from a policy standpoint, from a governance standpoint, and so forth. And then the last two things I'll mention in terms of what boards are doing to react to this environment. There's a massive shift in time allocation that I kind of alluded to before. And, one of the things, George, when we were going through our intro, I didn't mention, but again, this is not meant to be a plug at all, but I have, with two co-authors, we have a book out on governance called Talent, Strategy, Risk, the New TSR. And this was a Ram Shriram, the management guru who's out, who's been probably in 100 different boardrooms over the course of his career. He and the vice chair at Korn Ferry, Dennis Ferry, approached me about 5 years ago about working with them on this book and this idea. And we had met at a governance conference. And what we did is we went out and interviewed sort of top investors, directors whom we had great respect for, academics who were kind of pushing the boundaries in thinking and so forth. And we collected, I can't say data, I would say a lot of anecdotes, but certain themes emerged. And one of them was that in the best boardrooms, tremendous focus on talent and culture, tremendous focus on ongoing strategy. Now, I can come back to that, what that means. Tremendous focus on risk. That actually wasn't that new. I mean, boards had been, really since Sarbanes-Oxley, since the Enron crisis in early 2000s, risk has been foremost in many boardrooms. But I think a broadening of the definition of risk. And then, very importantly, how's the company executing against these different dimensions? And so what are the results? So, and again, in the best boardrooms that I see, and I'm in not just the ones I'm in, but I get to visit, quite a number of other companies. This is how the time is actually being spent. Real deep dives on all this. And again, we can come back and talk about practically how does that actually work. And then the last point I thought I would make is boards are actually really, really engaged in best practices. So you mentioned, George, in the intro, the work that we did on the framework for, the future of the American boardroom. And if you haven't downloaded a report from the NACD, I would encourage people in the audience to do so. You'll look at the 10 principles and you'll say, gee, those feel pretty familiar and pretty consistent with what NACD has done in the past. But when you dig down into the report, one of the things that's really interesting, and it was a different approach, frankly, rather than prescribing how we think each of these principles should apply in every boardroom, our strong belief was there was a series of questions that every board should ask itself around these principles, and different boards will come to different conclusions. And by the way, we certainly didn't imagine all the potential questions. We hope people will keep adding to it. But it's been interesting is this report, even before the report was formally issued, in the boardrooms I'm in, lots of reflection on what do we need to do to be a better performing board. And I mentioned ESG earlier. In one of my boards, that was a topic for the governance committee for an entire board session, was how are we going to integrate our thinking of ESG into the way we run the business? And what's that mean as directors in terms of our responsibilities? We actually went ahead and redid all of our committee charters to reflect how ESG would be governed, if you will, within the broader governance constructs that we had already created, and actually changed the language pretty dramatically on some of the charters to reflect this. And maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong in terms of the way we're approaching it, but it was an interesting exercise from my perspective, just in how serious the board took improving what it does in order to reflect, the realities of the marketplace going forward. So I think this is probably a good point for me just to stop talking. And again, what I wanted to do was just give you a little bit of context for how I think about things, and again, a very brief annotated history of how my own thinking got to where it is. And I really just do want to open it up and let you guys ask whatever's on your minds, and focus, what's most important for you to hear.
Thanks so much, Bill. So let me post a few questions. They're probably going to be from all over the place, so just to warn you a little bit. But thanks so much. The first question is from Philippe, who is asking that in the academic literature, we generally perceive index funds as what we would call passive investors. Now, you mentioned that these investors are what you call permanent capital, so they might have more of a saying on how firms are actually governed. Now, the question is, how do you think that they can influence boards? Although given that these funds hold stakes in multiple firms, do they have the bandwidth to actually monitor or influence multiple firms?
Yeah, great question. And one of the ironies in the whole evolution of governance is this will sound self-serving from Vanguard's perspective, but again, if you were to look at what actually has happened, it's all been driven by the indexers. Active managers, with the exception of the activists, could not spell the word governance. And I say that, very seriously. One of the things at Vanguard, we had the perspective, we ran both index and active equity. The way we ran active equity at Vanguard was we did not run it in-house. We actually subcontracted out, if you will, to 30 different firms around the world. So Bailey Gifford in Scotland, PrimeCap in Pasadena, California, Schroders in London, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a global set of players who all had different specialties. At the beginning of this journey, we went out and asked each and every one of them, how do you think about governance in your investment decision? And we got a universal, not at all. The only time we're actually even concerned with a board makeup is during an activist proxy fight. And so, how the world has changed. Now everybody wants to talk about how important governance is. And the question, your observation about the breadth of holdings and, how do you have the bandwidth is exactly the right point. So rather, we cannot go deep on the strategy of any particular company. Mm-hmm. So the focus for the index firms has to be on the process of governance and the quality of governance. So where we can go deep is on board composition. We can look at that pretty carefully across the entire portfolio. We can look at we can ask boards, we can engage with boards how they're going to reflect certain issues. So, when climate risk became a big topic, it was, don't take us through all the details of, how you're going to comply with, one particular proposal or another. We wanted to know, how do you view this as a risk? And how do you, as a board, how do you treat it? How are you getting your hands around it as a risk? So it was much more, everything has been very focused on the governance side, from the index side. And, now what's interesting is almost every major active manager has, jumped on the bandwagon, and, governance has become a much more fundamental part of the investment analysis. But it really, for us, we believe it was this, the fact that we can actually, and we will vote against, against directors. If there's a compensation perspective with which we don't agree with, we will vote against the comp committee chair on a board. Now, again, you'll look at the voting records of a lot of the index funds, and you'll say, gosh, you guys haven't been that aggressive in pursuing this. I think we're very careful about, making sure that we know enough to, when we're going to vote, either for or against management on a particular proposal, we want to make sure we have the depth of understanding, especially if we're going to vote against, because again, the presumption always is they know what they're doing. But if there is something that we disagree with dramatically, we will reflect it in the vote.
And how much, a related question, how much do you actually use the services and of, say, ISS, Glass Lewis, in making those decisions? Also evaluating boards or decisions whether or not to vote or against a certain director?
So at the large investors, I can tell you, nobody uses ISS and Glass Lewis. And this may not be popular. I don't know how people think about it. I don't know how much you guys have studied it. We have very, very low level of respect for what they do, to be very candid and blunt about it. We think the level of analysis is rudimentary at best, and the quality of work is rudimentary at best. And I actually think it's a massive mistake for small investors, small firms, to be relying on these guys. I think they're abrogating a fiduciary obligation, whether it's a legal fiduciary obligation or not, I don't know, but to me, it's a moral one. I don't know how you can not reflect your own views on governance as part of the investment management decision. To me, just is, it just doesn't follow. But these guys have filled a gap that that really is a reflection of a lot of small managers just not wanting to devote the time and energy to this. And I would say, frankly, they don't want the visibility on these issues. They want to just go, hey, it's we're just following what Glass Lewis and ISS say.
Thanks.
So again, a strong statement, but
absolutely lovely. Thank you for being so candid. So, follow-up question was in a Q&A here. Your reflection about the changes of firms and boards made the person asking the question wonder, how are these new challenges changing the selection process of new board members? So do you see any changes in who joins the board and the selection process? So are there skills or knowledge that board members are interested in developing the most these days?
Yeah, so I would say great question. And there's this is like this is a work in progress right now and among a lot of boards, but what you're seeing is, again, I'm going to be overly simplistic here just to make the point. If you went back 25 years ago in the Fortune 100, basically every board was, it was sort of like a CEO all-star group, right? So a bunch of CEOs who had either just retired or who might be allowed by their own boards to be on one or two external boards. And so you would see that was the composition of a lot of your Fortune 500 boards. Today, you see much broader representation. And, I would say the two or three things that you're seeing reflected most aggressively are, in businesses where there is a particular sector expertise that could be helpful. You're seeing people reflect that. So let me use United as a classic example. This is all public, but we have two of the leading clinical thinkers in the world on our board. So Valerie Montgomery Rice, who heads up a medical school, and John Noseworthy, the former chairman and CEO of the Mayo Clinic. And before he was CEO of Mayo, he was a preeminent neurologist. When those guys talk about clinical outcomes and best practices in terms of interfacing with doctors and what kind of data should we be generating and sharing and all that kind of stuff that's related to the actual treatment of patients, people like me who have a much more of a capital markets business strategic perspective, I sit up, like I'm taking notes because it is just so incredibly valuable to us to have that kind of expertise. And I would say broadly, you're seeing best boards try to find that expertise. Now, what you try not to do is you try not to go too narrow. So, John, I'm going to use again, John as a great example. John ran the Mayo Clinic. It's a complex business. He was a CEO. So you've got leadership, you've got broad strategic thinking, people development skills, but unbelievable depth on the clinical side. So you're always kind of looking for that kind of complementarity. Cyber is a hot topic right now, obviously, and there's people outside looking in saying you should have a cyber expert on the board. Well, I would say yes, but if that's all the person brings to the board, that's not going to be particularly helpful. You need somebody who can actually keep up on all the other issues, or it's not going to really trend well. Now, again, and I'll use IBM. We have Admiral Howard, Michelle Howard, retired four-star admiral from the Navy. Her last assignment was running Cyber Command. So pretty deep expert on cyber policy, in particular political, what government entities are doing from a cyber warfare standpoint and where we might be vulnerable, et cetera. But she's also a four-star admiral who had command of, multiple, fleets, ships, the whole bit. She's a people leader. She's deep on all the talent development and linking that to strategy and so forth. So again, brings much more than just cyber expertise to the dance. But when she talks about cyber in particular, like again, everybody's taking notes because no one knows, especially what goes on in the government side there better than she does. So anyway, it's a long-winded way of saying there's a lot of that kind of thinking going on in the board. One of the things it's also doing is I think most boards have recognized that diversity of experience, which is often reflected by more traditional diversity metrics, if you will, but that diversity of experience is really, really valuable. And that's causing people to look into, not just at the CEO level or the chief operating officer level, but to look for, senior executives who have breadth, but who might not be at that level. And maybe you're a little younger, maybe you've got a different worldview. And again, you could sort of look at some of the people who are, again, if you look at the Fortune 50 companies in the US in particular, you're starting to see some real interesting additions to boards that reflect that kind of thinking.
If I can jump in there a little bit. So the question about selection processes, right? So did anything change? You mentioned at the beginning, it used to be the other CEOs of Fortune 500.
So I would say the governance committee is actually a lot more engaged. There was a time when, again, 20 years ago, the CEO generally would come up with a list of candidates for the board, and then the governance committee would kind of vet the best two and kind of bless it. Actually, yes, the CEOs are engaged, but I'm telling you, the governance committees are really driving it, and they're driving the selection. Again, at least in the best boards that I see. The other thing I would say is some of them are using very clever techniques. So at one of the boards I'm on, we actually have an advisory committee of investors, and it's 5 investors, and it rotates. 5 of our probably 15 largest investors. They meet once or twice a year. They tell us what's on their mind, what we should be thinking about from an investor perspective. One of the topics, though, that is always there is, as you look at our board, what are we missing?
Mhm.
And we're not necessarily going to be looking to them for specific names, but we will look for themes. And, if somebody says, I hear you on, you want people who are good GMs and who can cover the breadth, but we look at your cyber footprint. We're really worried about that. Talk to us about how you're thinking about your next board member and what he or she might reflect in terms of that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not something that's been adopted by that many companies, but it's pretty cool, and it actually works really, really well.
Thank you so much. There's a related question about a top executive. So probably typical CEO, CFO, C-suite members joining board of directors. So in your experience, do you find that the attributes of being a good executive can sometimes impede a person to sit on a board or to be a good board member?
I think the fear always is that some executives won't recognize the difference between governance and management. And by the way, this is when you get into where you get board members who are really a little narrower and deeper, and sometimes who have great technical expertise in a particular field that's related to what the company does. You will see that reflected in, again, that's where a good lead director and chair says, you're crossing lines you shouldn't cross, and feedback becomes very important. I would say, though, I don't see it happen that often. I've certainly seen it. I've certainly heard about it, but I wouldn't say it's a troubling trend. One of the things we're actually seeing, again, public companies in particular have really put limits on letting their people join external boards while they're still working. Mm-hmm. Again, it used to be much more common. And even at Vanguard, we had those limits. Like, none of us were allowed to sit on a board. There were obvious conflict issues, but there was also just as you're too busy. The value of being on one board for a sitting C-suite executive is unbelievable in terms of what you can learn. Mm-hmm. And we're starting to see some companies open up a little bit more. One, it's expanding the pool. Two, it's actually teaching people to be good board members a little bit earlier in their careers, which is, I think, very helpful. And very importantly, they bring back to their own companies best practices that they see. So one of the things we did at Vanguard, so none of us did public companies, but when I was running one of the businesses, our chair and CEO literally made me. I mean, he's like, you will go get very engaged in a nonprofit board. And he goes, it's a great way for you to give back to your community. But he goes, I want you to be on a board that's got really good people, and you're going to learn something and you're going to bring it back. So it was a sort of a win-win, and I did. And, we stole a lot of great practices from this nonprofit in terms of, just refining how we did our own board meetings and so forth. And it was really helpful.
Thank you so much, Phil. There's a question. We're shifting a little bit the topic now. From Monique. She says, Talent Strategy Risk is a great approach and a great title for a book. And she asked if you could elaborate a little bit more on the talent part of talent strategy and risk. So what do you look at, and how talent in the boardroom and executive committee further in the organization? Yeah, so,
it used to be, and this is just going back a few years, that most talent and comp committees, first of all, talent wasn't mentioned, it was comp. It was the comp committee, and they sort of also would take a look at talent. It was all around succession. And it was generally the CEO succession and maybe the C-suite succession. What we're seeing now is a much deeper dive into the top couple tiers of organizations. So again, I'll use Vanguard because I can be very specific there. We were a 15,000 person company when I retired. We took our board essentially statistically through the top 1,000 people on a regular basis. And, what did that top 1,000 look like? who was emerging, who needed what new assignments and so forth. It was a lot. But we wanted the board to understand how much time and energy we spent on trying to develop that next group, because out of that top 1,000 will come our 200 partners, if you will. We call them principals. And then out of that group, out of that 200 will come the 10 people who would comprise the senior, the executive team. And we wanted our board to actually see that far into the organization. For two reasons. One, just to have a sense that we weren't dependent on any one individual. We were much more of a team-based organization. And two, to get a sense of the culture, because culture is one of those hard things to measure, but you know it and feel it when you experience it, and you know when it's off oftentimes. And so the more exposure we could get to it, get our board to our culture, the better we felt. So, if I flip it around to the boards I'm on today, one of the things that's been fun over the last several years has been to watch the evolution. A couple of them, the only time we ever talked about talent was at compensation time. And, when we were doing the formal, we got to have a succession plan in case the CEO gets hit by a bus. Well, we're now in both my public company boards and most of my private company boards. Talent is a major topic in every board meeting. There's and it may not be the review of the top 1,000 at Vanguard each board meeting. We're not going to do that, but we'll pick a big theme. And again, in the two public companies here, the leaders of the talent organizations will come in and we will thematically go deep. And it may be, what's the senior team look like, and who's coming up? That may be one meeting. The next meeting may be, what are we doing to attract more technical expertise in quantum and 2 or 3 other categories that are really important, data science, which are really important to us. But it's always on the agenda. It's always on the agenda. And I think that's a pretty big shift. And then the last thing I would say to Monique's question is, we're encouraging board members to get out into the company in unsupervised status, so take a trip to a clinic at United, or, at IBM, we went to the R&D center in London last year, and spend time with much more junior people and just unsupervised, so what's it like to work here? What are you hearing? Where are we going as a company thematically? And it's really interesting to compare what the CEO says with what, a frontline engineer says. And if there's real compatibility there, you're like, wow, the communication's really working well. And if there's not, then you've got other questions. So, and I know that sounds a little soft and fluffy, but it's amazing how much insight you can get. One of the organizations I'm no longer a board member on, it was one of the big 4 accounting firms, but I was chair of their independent audit quality committee, which was essentially like a board. We went and met every year with frontline accountants and their just first level of management. And the disconnect between what we'd hear there and what we might hear in the C-suite, a couple of times was pretty. And by the way, the C-suite loved it, because we came back with, we know you're saying this, because we actually see the communication, but this is how they're interpreting it. And as a board, that's real value add. So that's more than, in a sense. I mean, that's and by the way, that's a theme that I didn't really mention in my remarks, but one of the things that you see in private companies is the boards are an amazing resource for the management team. Like, you can tap into your board constantly for expertise. In the best public company boards, we're starting to see that. So, I got a call the other day from one of, one of the CFOs saying, hey, we're about to engage with XYZ investor. What do you know these guys? What do you think about them? How should we approach this? Are there any taboo topics? And I'm just, giving my opinion, but it's input to them to make them better. A little less pure governance, right? I mean, it's actually value add as a board member to the business, requested by the management team. when you have boards and management teams really functioning well and in sync, that's a great aspect.
Thank you so much. So let's move topic a little bit again. And we talked a little bit when we had the chat before we started the webinar about a new practice that we increasingly observe in the US and also in other parts of the world, so-called CEO activism. So CEOs taking a stance on a contentious topic that is currently heavily discussed. So you as a CEO and you as a board member, you as a CEO, have you ever taken a stance on any potentially contentious issue? And as a board member, how do you think about it?
Yeah. So when I was CEO at Vanguard, there were probably more than I know, but I know the two that sort of sing out. When Charlottesville happened, I responded with a pretty aggressive message to our entire company about our views on the violence at Charlottesville and how appalling it was. And there were some people who said, it's not your place, you're not an expert, you're not telling the whole story, blah, blah, blah. You can imagine the politicization of that. I would say from our employee base, 95% of what I heard was, we're really glad you said something. We know, because they actually knew how important Charlottesville was to me personally, because I'd had a daughter go there, a son-in-law go there, a niece go there, and I had written about that in some of my blogs. So for me not to speak out would have been strange, but it certainly, there were certainly waves. Probably the bigger one, though, was when we joined the 30% Club, which is the movement to get boards to be composed of at least 30% women. And, this was a Bloomberg, Mike Bloomberg's chair, Peter Grauer really led the effort in the US. It was really based on a UK effort, as you may know. And I took some heat for that one because we were the first big major US asset manager, the first big index fund manager to sign up for the group. And I can remember sitting in the audience, at the press conference where they were announcing this, and people chirping about, that's very un-Vanguard-like. You guys are always free market. Why are you, why are you imposing this and so forth? And I had to do a little thought experiment with the audience to try to explain myself. But when I reflect on those, Charlottesville, to me, people knew the deep personal connection. Board composition is something that because of my experience as a large investor, and something that we had written and spoken about a lot. I was already working on the talent strategy risk book at the time, so I've been thinking a lot about board composition there. Call myself an expert is probably too self-aggrandizing, but I certainly had some expertise. And that actually has shaped the way I think about this in a lot of ways. I think CEOs need to be careful about speaking out on things that they really don't have any expertise on. They may be really important issues, but if you don't really know the topic, I think you run a lot of risk. And as a board member, certainly the questions we ask are, when somebody says, I think I need to speak out on this, or we suggest we think you need to speak out on this, we're looking, do you have expertise and therefore credibility on the topic, and something really to add. And then I think you do have to ask the question, how does this benefit? And you don't have to say just the shareholders, by the way, you can include other stakeholders, but how does this either benefit or detriment the major stakeholders? So shareholders, employees, suppliers. And again, there's not going to be a real science to it. It's going to be more of a judgment call at the end of the day. But I would say if, A, you don't have expertise, and B, you haven't thought through the implications to those really key stakeholders, it's probably not something you should do. And I think if you can answer appropriately those issues, yes, something about this, and yes, I understand the impact to my various stakeholders, and I'm prepared, and we as the board should be prepared to live with the consequences of that, positive or negative. Then I think it's something that I think that's how the board has to think about it. And it's like anything else, right? There's we don't live in a zero risk world. So, we spend hours and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on cyber, for example. Well, I'm here to tell you, almost everybody is going to have a privacy breach at some point or a cyber issue at some point. And so the question then becomes, what's the acceptable risk level as a board? And then, very importantly, how are you going to remediate it? How are you going to, isolate the rest of the company from it? It's, all those kinds of tactical things, if you will, that you really have to take into account. This, to me, is, there's got to be kind of parallel thinking around this.
So 2 questions. One is very short, and one we might keep the answer a bit shorter because in the sake of time. The very short one is, Ruth asked, what is the title of the NACD report on the 10 principles? What is the title of?
Yeah, it's the title is The Future of the American Board, a Framework for Governing into the Future. Right. Just was issued at the end of the year, and it's been interesting. It's made the rounds in a lot of boardrooms, and again, love to hear any feedback any of you have as you go through it. We've generally gotten pretty positive feedback that it's helpful. I don't think it's revolutionary, but it's just another step in trying to evolve the quality of boardroom performance and governance.
Mm-hmm. And then the second question. So there's a question about that, for example, Larry Fink of BlackRock has said that carbon burning firms have a higher risk in terms of growing environmental crisis concerns. Now, a lot of investors are using some kind of ESG measures. Now, academic literature has shown that those ESG measures tend to different things. They give it different weight. So long story short, they tend to disagree with one another. Like you as a board member, how do you go about this? Especially that, ESG is very difficult to quantify and to measure consistently.
Yeah, well, I think the climate challenge question is probably the most complicated one out there in terms of ESG broadly. I think so. I'll state that up front. There's, to your point, there are no data that show that ESG screens, whether they're climate based or social equity based. We haven't seen anybody do something on a governance index, if you will, but we've certainly seen social equity type benchmarks, and we've certainly seen climate as a filter. There's no evidence that those kind of portfolios perform better. In fact, I would tell you my strong belief, I can't prove it obviously because it's in the future, is over the long run, they won't perform as well. When Vanguard, when we offered our first ESG, which are exclusionary funds, they exclude certain companies based on ESG factors. We put in bold letters in the prospectus, you should expect returns to differ from that of the broad market and perhaps underperform. And we wanted people to say, it doesn't matter. It's really important to me that I invest in a portfolio that doesn't hold these types of companies, and I'm okay with it if it underperforms. That is a very different approach than anybody else is taking in the industry, as you know. I mean, everybody's promoting that, you can do good by doing good. And I'm very skeptical about that, to be 100% candid from a pure investment perspective. We've seen every way possible people have tried to actively manage against the broad market, and over 10 years, 90% of them fail. And the 10% who do outperform the market don't do so consistently. It's usually a revolving group of people when you look at rolling 10 years. So the data suggests to me that it's going to be a very hard task. So, and again, I'm actually again, I have an immense amount of respect for Larry and what they built there at BlackRock. I'm a little bothered that they are commercially much more happy to have people in ESG product than they are in their straight beta product, because the revenue is 4 or 5 or 6x what it is in the straight beta products, and the work isn't 4 or 5 or 6 times more expensive, so the margins are much, much higher. And you're seeing this push by active managers and some of the big indexers into ESG oriented funds. I think they're conflicted commercially. So because they are better off if an investor puts his or her money in there. And I just think investors have to be very careful and skeptical about that. By the way, it doesn't mean as an investor, you shouldn't put money there if that's what you want to do, but you should just understand that whole context.
So I was muted. We're out of time, unfortunately. Sorry for those whose question we couldn't answer here, but I want to be mindful of the time. Bill, thank you so much for spending an hour with us, for sharing your experiences with us, your view on certain trends that are happening right now in the boardrooms, especially in the US, and about future trends. It's been a tremendously insightful webinar for me, and I think most of the participants here will agree as well, or all of them will agree. So thank you so much for being with us here today, and thank you everybody for joining us and for posting so many interesting questions. We will see each other again, hopefully, on April the 5th, Wednesday, same time, same place, where Randall Patterson from London Business School will introduce his book on dysfunctional boards. So it's going to be an interesting session. So please do join us again, and Bill, feel invited to join us again in the future. And
that sounds like an amazing work. I may try to do that because I'm a fan of some of what he's written. So that would be great. But anyway, thank you for having me, and it's a real privilege to get to see you and at least virtually meet so many of you.